Welcome to Dialogue. When we talk about science, I think we all have this really pristine image in our heads.
The ideal.
The ideal, exactly. A lab, bright lights, brilliant people just chasing truth, driven by pure curiosity, inquiry, doubt.
Right.
That's the marble statue of science we're sort of taught to admire.
And that ideal is important. It's motivational, but it's really only half the picture. The truth is that science, the way it's actually done today, doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No.
It happens inside institutions, universities, government labs, research centers. And those places, well, they don't run on pure curiosity. They run on resources, on budgets, on hierarchies, and maybe most of all, on some very powerful incentives.
Okay, so let's dig into that. We're sort of shifting the lens here, moving away from the textbook scientific method and looking at the economic reality of it, the power structures that decide where all that inquiry even gets pointed in the first place. Our mission for this deep dive is to try and expose that hidden architecture, the funding, the influence, the strategic interests that are quietly shaping what questions even get asked, what data gets published, and then ultimately what the world is told to believe is scientific consensus.
You're getting at the core conflict of modern science. It doesn't move forward just because a researcher has a fascinating question.
If only.
If only. If that were the case, our research priorities might look completely different. We might be tackling huge global problems that just don't have an obvious path to making money.
So what does it move according to?
It moves according to grants. It moves according to political priorities set way outside the lab. And it moves according to very specific corporate or ideological interests. And that directionality, that's everything. It's what determines which questions get billions in funding, and just as importantly, with vital questions get ignored because they're not convenient or profitable.
The power of the unasked question. It sounds like the silent controller of what we even get to know.
It absolutely is. I mean, think about it this way. Behind every big breakthrough you read about, every headline that starts with "studies show," there's a trail.
A trail of money.
A trail of money, of incentives, of strategic interests that guided the whole process. And let's be clear here, this isn't always some grand conspiracy. It's not always intentional corruption.
It's just how the system is built.
It's the natural result of how we allocate resources. But whether the influence is malicious or just structural, the effect is the same. The science we get is filtered. It's selective. It's shaped by the economics behind it all.
So the goal here isn't to say that science itself is broken, but to understand that the results we see, the body of knowledge we all rely on, is inherently selective.
It has to be. It's been run through a powerful economic filter. And if you really want to understand the science, you have to first understand who holds the financial reins and, what their goal is, because that dictates everything long before a single experiment is even run.
Okay, that sets a perfect framework for our first section then, funding. You called it the leash on scientific freedom.
It is.
That's a powerful analogy, especially when you realize that most cutting-edge research, the kind that leads to new drugs, new tech, new policies, is completely dependent on huge resources. Without the money, there are no massive studies, no particle accelerators.
That dependency is the fundamental reality of it all. It makes funding the primary gatekeeper. And once the gate is open, it becomes the director of where you go.
So who are these directors? Who are the major players holding that leash?
It's a pretty complex ecosystem, but you can break it down into a few really powerful categories.
Right.
At the top, you have corporations. Their goal is pretty straightforward. Research that gives them a market advantage, validates their products, or protects them from regulation.
Then you have the government.
Then you have powerful government agencies, yeah.
No.
They're more focused on national strategy, security, public health mandates. And then there's a third force, one that's often overlooked but is incredibly powerful.
And that is?
Philanthropic foundations. Despite their benevolent mission statements, they have enormous power to define what problems are even considered worthy of research in the first place.
And I imagine it goes even wider than that.
Oh, absolutely. You have to factor in the defense sectors globally. Huge, often secret budgets driving very specific research. Then there are the multinational conglomerates, think big tech or global food companies funding research that supports their supply chains.
And what about smaller players?
They're becoming more relevant. Specialized advocacy organizations, they use targeted funding to build a body of science that directly supports their policy goals. They're basically using science as a tool for political change.
That's an incredible list of stakeholders.
Yeah.
And the one thing they all have in common is that not a single one of them has pure curiosity as their main goal.
That is the pivotal insight. They're all after truths that align with their mandates, their profits, their politics. Funding directs knowledge. It doesn't just support it.
So when a big pharma company or a government agency puts billions into one area,
They're sending a massive signal to the entire scientific community. They're saying, this is the problem that matters now. These are the methods we'll pay for.
which brings us to the big so what's question for anyone listening. If the money is dictating the questions, how does that limit what we as a society get to discover?
The result is a profound systemic limitation. If all the capital flows toward commercially viable or politically safe topics, then huge, crucial areas of potential knowledge just go unexplored.
The stuff that might challenge a powerful industry, for instance.
Exactly. Or solve a problem that mainly affects poor countries and doesn't have a big profit margin. Research that's inconvenient or disruptive or just too niche to get a grant. It often just dies on the vine.
So the scientific literature we read, the consensus we're told to trust, it's really just one highly curated, economically viable slice of what could have been known. It creates these huge intellectual blind spots.
That's a perfect way to put it. We become hyper-aware of the small area where the flashlight is shining, but we're completely oblivious to what's in the darkness all around it. And that darkness might hold equally important but unfunded answers.
So the assumption that the scientific community is just tackling all the biggest problems facing humanity is, well, it's just wrong.
It's fundamentally flawed. They're addressing the questions that get funded, the questions that are accessible with approved methods, the questions that align with the strategic interests of the people holding the purse strings. The architecture of influence starts right there.
We've established the who is holding the purse strings. Now let's get into the how. The specific ways they use science, starting with corporations. Their stake is immediate and financial. They're not just looking for knowledge, they're looking for, well, commercial artillery.
Right. And when you look at corporate interest, you see them using science in 4 really critical ways. The first is the most obvious one, to validate products and protect patents.
The classic case. You invent a new drug, you need the studies that prove it works and is safe. It's your defense.
It's your commercial defense, exactly.
Yeah.
It's what you take to the patent office in the marketplace. But the next 3 ways are more about defense in a different sense.
Okay.
Second, and this is often much more aggressive, they fund science to avoid regulation and lobby governments.
So the studies become a kind of shield.
A very powerful shield. They can walk into a hearing and say, look, our independently funded peer-reviewed science shows that regulating this substance is unnecessary, even if that science was designed very, very narrowly.
The third way.
The third is to shape public perception. This is narrative control. They fund research that highlights the benefits of their industry while maybe, conveniently, not funding research into its long-term negative impacts.
It's controlling the conversation, making sure the public is debating on your terms.
And finally, and this is crucial, they influence clinical trials and safety narratives by controlling the design of the experiments themselves.
How does that work in practice?
They can control who gets into a study, how the statistics are analyzed, and, most importantly, they can choose to measure specific surrogate endpoints instead of hard clinical outcomes.
Okay, hold on. That's a technical term. Surrogate endpoints. Can you break that down for us? Why is that so important?
It's a critical mechanism of control. A hard clinical outcome is something undeniable. A heart attack, a death, a cure.
Something that really matters to a patient.
Exactly. A surrogate endpoint is something that's believed to correlate with that hard outcome but isn't the outcome itself. So, for example, measuring a drop in cholesterol levels instead of an actual drop in heart attacks.
Ah, I see. So a drug company can show their pill lowers cholesterol, the surrogate, and call it a success, even if they haven't proven it actually saves lives from heart attacks.
Precisely. It lets them get a positive, publishable result much faster and more reliably. It's an economically safer bet than a decade-long trial measuring hard outcomes. And history is just filled with stark examples of this kind of influence in action.
Let's walk through a few of them.
Of course. The most famous one is probably the tobacco industry. For decades, they funded their own research specifically designed to introduce doubt, not to prove smoking was safe, but just to create a cloud of scientific uncertainty in the public mind.
A strategy of manufacturing doubt. And that's been copied by other industries, right?
Absolutely. We've seen it with fossil fuel companies and climate research. Again, the goal wasn't necessarily to disprove climate change, but to fund research that emphasized uncertainty, natural cycles, anything to delay political action.
And it happens with things we consume every single day.
It's so subtle but pervasive. Think about food companies shaping nutritional guidelines. They fund endless studies on the benefits of certain nutrients they produce or downplaying the risks of sugar. And that directly steers public health policy toward the most profitable products.
And bringing this right into the present, this same mechanism is shaping how we think about the risks of new technology.
Look at AI safety narratives. As these systems get more and more powerful, who's funding the research into their potential dangers? Often, it's the very companies building them.
So they get to frame the conversation.
They get to direct the conversation towards solutions that favor them, like internal ethics boards, instead of, say, restrictive government regulation that might slow down their race to dominate the market. The economics of control are playing out in real time right now.
So if corporate science is a tool for profit and defense, how is government influence different? The state doesn't have a quarterly report to worry about, but it definitely has a power motive.
That's the key distinction. The government isn't driven by profit. It's driven by strategic priorities, national security, and political control. They use science for power and for policy justification.
Can you break down those priorities?
Sure. First and foremost, governments fund science for national security and economic protection. Think of agencies like DARPA. This is everything from advanced weapons to securing supply chains for rare minerals. Science becomes a tool of statecraft.
Making the scientific community almost a civilian branch of national strategy.
In many fields, yes. Second, and this is much more public, they need science to justify legislation. You can't pass a major climate policy or a public health initiative without a mountain of studies to back it up. Studies often funded by government agencies themselves.
And then they use that government-backed consensus to steer public opinion.
Exactly. It's used for shaping public messaging and political narratives. When a government wants to roll out a big new policy, they use controlled scientific communication to make it seem inevitable and evidence-based, no matter how much dissent might exist in the raw data.
It's fascinating. Corporations use science to protect their patents, and governments use it to consolidate power and justify policy. Two massive systems of influence running in parallel.
Which brings us back to where we started. Science cannot exist in an ideological vacuum. The idea of a researcher totally divorced from the political world is, well, it's a fantasy. The second that public or private money is allocated to a question, that question becomes part of a power structure.
We've looked at the external leash, the money from corporations and governments, but now we need to turn inward to the academic world itself. The publish or perish dilemma. This is a different kind of pressure.
It's maybe the most insidious pressure because it creates these perverse incentives that can really erode the integrity of the research from the inside.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, the career path for an academic, especially one trying to get tenure, isn't defined by long, thoughtful truth-seeking. It's defined by brutal metrics. You have to publish frequently in big-name journals. Your work has to be cited a lot. You have to win prestigious grants.
It's a competition for visibility, not necessarily for truth.
Exactly. It's weaponizing metrics. And when the metric, the number of publications, overrides the mission, you get several predictable, systemic, and negative outcomes.
Okay, let's detail those. How does this system push good researchers toward bad practices?
First, it heavily encourages safe research and trend chasing.
Safe research.
Yeah. If you know your lab's funding depends on securing another grant next year, you can't afford to chase a really high-risk novel idea that might not produce a clear, publishable result quickly.
Right. Something that could take a decade and fail a bunch of times before it works.
That kind of research is financially lethal for a young academic, so instead, they follow the established fundable paths. They chase the hot topic of the year.
So if gene editing is getting all the funding, everyone suddenly becomes a gene editing expert.
That's it. It's why science can often be so slow to adopt truly new ideas. The system is financially incentivized to stay in its comfort zone. The second major consequence is widespread data distortion.
So not outright fraud, but bending the rules.
Precisely. When the main goal is to get a positive result, something that confirms your hypothesis and is therefore publishable, the pressure is immense. You see practices like p-hacking.
P-hacking.
You run dozens of different statistical tests on your data until you find something, anything, that looks statistically significant, even if it wasn't what you were looking for. Then there's arcing.
Which is?
Hypothesizing after the results are known. You find an accidental correlation, and then you rewrite your paper's introduction to pretend that was your brilliant hypothesis all along.
You're essentially fitting the story to the data instead of the other way around. And it's all driven by this need to get a positive result, because a negative result is seen as a failure.
It's a career setback. The system doesn't reward studies that prove a hypothesis was wrong, even though that's incredibly valuable information. And that leads to the third and most worrying outcome: the systemic suppression of negative results.
The file grow problem.
The file drawer problem, exactly. Data that doesn't fit the neat story, or worse, that undermines your funder's interest, just gets quietly put away. It never sees the light of day.
So if a clinical trial shows a new, expensive drug is no better than a cheap generic, that paper might just disappear if the company funded it.
It happens all the time, and it completely warps the entire body of scientific knowledge. It creates a massive publication bias where the literature is heavily skewed toward positive, confirmed findings. It gives everyone an artificially inflated view of how effective things are.
It's like if a news outlet only reported on stories with happy endings. You get a very distorted view of the world.
And this traps the researcher in a loop. Safe research gets funded, positive results get published, those publications get cited. And that helps you secure the next grant for more safe research. Truly groundbreaking work struggles to get a foothold.
Okay, so we've covered profit, power, and internal pressure. Let's pivot to a sector that has immense power, but operates under this cloak of benevolence, the philanthropic foundation.
Their benevolent appearance is their greatest strength. Foundations are incredibly effective mechanisms for turning private wealth into long-term ideological and scientific influence. They're not funding science for profit. They're funding it for worldview outcomes.
Worldview outcomes.
Yep.
So they want the research to support the specific kind of societal change they believe in.
That's the core of it. And they exert control through a very specific selection process. First, they get to select what even counts as a worthy problem.
How so?
By pouring billions of dollars into one area, say a specific educational theory, they are essentially defining the priority list for the entire research community. Universities and researchers will naturally flock to where the money is.
They're acting like central planners for what problems get our attention.
Exactly. Secondly, they prioritize specific outcomes. They're not usually funding open-ended exploration. They're funding research that's likely to produce the intellectual ammunition they need to advance their own agenda.
So the scientist can, in some ways, become an implementer of the foundation's strategic vision.
That's the danger. And that leads to the third point. They create approved research ecosystems. By consistently funding certain universities or certain departments, they create a network of trusted institutions and voices that dominate a field.
It's like building your own intellectual supply chain.
It is. They create these centers of scientific gravity, and it reinforces the whole system we've been talking about. The priorities of the people with the money define the entire enterprise. They become the gatekeepers who decide which voices get heard and amplified.
This is a much more durable way of controlling science than just buying one study. You're shaping the entire intellectual foundation for the next generation.
It creates a sophisticated, self-fulfilling prophecy of scientific consensus. When all the money, all the prestigious journals, and all the top academics are focused on questions defined by a handful of powerful foundations, the answers you get will naturally reflect those priorities.
We've traced the money from the initial decision to fund something all the way through the research process. But the cycle isn't complete until that information gets to the public. The final stage is the translation of that complex data into public dialogue.
And this is where science often fully becomes marketing. The findings don't stay in academic journals. They move into the public arena. And in that translation process, their meaning is fundamentally altered.
The first casualty is nuance.
Always. The public doesn't read a 50-page paper filled with statistical qualifications. They need a simple, clear takeaway.
The headline.
The headline, the infographic, the social media factoid. The goal shifts from accuracy to impact. A study might cautiously conclude, "We found a small correlation that warrants further study." And the headline screams, "Study proves X causes Y."
The very thing science tries to avoid certainty is what public communication demands.
And that gap is where the filtering happens. This is where we get that universal shorthand that we're all conditioned to accept. Experts say.
Right. So, given everything we've talked about, what does experts say actually mean in this context?
It's often shorthand for something very specific. It means the institutions with the most influence, secured by the most funding, and approved by the most powerful gatekeepers say.
It's not about a lone genius in a lab. It's about the consensus of the funded ecosystem.
It is. The expert status is institutionally conferred. It's based on where you publish and who funds you, not just the raw quality of your ideas. And that brings us to the final point here.
Which
The public understanding is shaped not by the data itself, but by a curated version of truth, filtered through economics and incentives.
It's the difference between seeing the raw code and seeing the polished final app. The public only ever sees the app, the presentation, the certainty.
And that curated version of truth is designed to do two things. First, tell you what to know. But second, and more powerfully, it's designed to tell you how to feel about it. Complexity becomes a soundbite. Uncertainty becomes certainty. And that drives public behavior in the direction that the funders wanted all along.
This has been a deeply insightful journey. We started with that ideal of pure science, but we've ended up dissecting the financial and institutional machine that powers it. Understanding these economics seems absolutely key to navigating the world today.
It is.
Unless you move beyond just accepting a headline and start asking, okay, who paid for this?
Yeah.
What were they hoping to find? Who benefits from me believing this?
And as we close out, I want to leave you with one final thought to explore on your own. We've established that funding dictates which questions get asked and therefore which ones are ignored.
Mhm.
So if our entire search for knowledge is constantly steered away from topics that are politically inconvenient or economically unprofitable, how does that massive systemic absence of research in those areas shape the future risks that we, as a society, simply fail to anticipate until it's too late? That darkness where the flashlight never points is arguably the most dangerous and unexplored territory of all.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.